Arctic Acoustic. I love the music. Hey, thanks for coming back to Hanging with History. This is Season 1, That Miracle That Happened. That One Time. This is Episode 31. Francis Drake is Aragorn. The Elizabethan Age, Part 3. And we've got Bygdøy joining us on the program. She's not a museum. She's a warm-hearted person with a caring perspective. And you might notice a slight change to the sound. We had a couple of complaints from people who listen in different ways. We made a graphic equalizer change, and I hope this works better for you. Let me know if it does. Thank you. Last week, we introduced the undeclared war of piracy the English were waging on Spain. This was still going on at a low level throughout the 1580s, and the events of 1585 were only a dramatic acceleration. I also mentioned the relatively small English government revenue of around £250,000 to £300,000 a year. We'll get into the economics of this, but I've been told that some people want their piracy more concentrated, so that's what I'll do. An important piece of background is the ongoing Dutch war for independence against Spain. That seemed to be going well for Spain for a while. The more radical Protestants, the true believers, pushed for intervention. That ratcheted up the pressure on Elizabeth to do something.
You might think that a monarch would be immune from public pressure. That might even be a big advantage in formulating intelligent policy.
A monarch could have all kinds of pressure. There are the people that she sees every day, for example. Cecil tended to lean Puritan, and Dudley, Earl of Leicester, some call him Dudders. You know who you are. Posed as the champion of the radicals. And there are the great landowners, the merchants, the City of London Corporation, the judiciary, and of course Parliament is in charge of a lot of that lovely money. The real risk, especially to a queen, and as an aside a pope, was that some powerful figure would take physical control over your body and in effect rule in your name. This happened to Mary Queen of Scots, and 2 of the 3 early conspiracies against Elizabeth were of this type. So, when powerful figures in court are all convinced of the urgency and the need to support the Dutch, Elizabeth had to do something. Remember, we summarized Henry's problems as power, money, succession, and love. I'd summarize Elizabeth's as keeping the throne, as distinct from getting more power, and her finances. Henry had a huge part of the economy available to plunder, namely the monasteries. But Elizabeth had fewer options, so she economized with no major building projects, and also taxed with a light hand. This was doubtless helpful for the English economy in the long run.
I don't know. You might be trying to slip in some of your anti-tax ideology there.
I don't mean that in an anti-tax ideological way. I'm not saying that for all places and times lower taxes make a stronger economy. I mean that, and essentially everyone would agree, that in a situation where there's all this under- and unemployment, along with a screaming shortage of investment capital, generally, low taxes are far preferable to high taxes. However, this meant that the military forces on land and sea were not well provided for. The Royal Navy benefited from Hawkins as a superior administrator, squeezing out corruption, which is always destructive of efficiency and effectiveness. One thing you really get from history is that corruption is for the second rate. By curbing corruption, Hawkins could do more with less. So, in 1584, a whole lot of large-scale piracy is being planned for the next year. Drake had his plans, Frobisher had plans, Carlyle all had plans. Hawkins wrote this really interesting memo, which if it wasn't so singular, could almost be called grand strategy. He suggested a widespread piracy campaign against Spain, under the legal cover of license from the pretender to the Portuguese throne. Remember, Spanish-Portuguese relations deteriorated last episode partly as a result of Drake's expedition, and the result was that Spain swallowed up Portugal. Hawkins thought that the Dutch and the Huguenots would join in and the Portuguese colonies, especially Brazil, would revolt. They could destroy Spanish fishing and paralyze Spanish trade, and the evil of English piracy would disappear, because all the unemployed seamen would be employed in this venture. And it is really interesting and surprising that Hawkins would draw a line from unemployed seamen to piracy. It could have just been polemics as discussed with Jolt and Joe in episode 22. The existence of polemics is a big problem with historical textual analysis, but Hawkins would probably be the best informed source at the time, and possibly he knew that this was true. I mean, the Hawkins brothers had been licensing piracy like this for a few years now. This strategic plan was not formally adopted, but many events of 1585 would play out as if. In May of 1585, Philip seized all English merchant ships in Iberia. Just took them. Ostensibly, it was to prepare an invasion fleet. Yes, that was the stated purpose. You could hear the gulps of the English all over the country. They're going to invade us with our own ships.
That must have been terrifying and outrageous all at once.
Those would be the feelings. But what about the psychology of a situation like that?
It would put images in your mind, wouldn't it? The idea of being invaded by Spain would become a part of you, sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So, a couple things happened. Elizabeth prepared to intervene with land forces in the United Provinces. That would take care of Leicester. Cecil seized Spanish treasure that was already in England en route to paying the Spanish army in Flanders, under the pretense that it actually belonged to Genoese bankers until it had been dispersed to Spanish troops. So you see, this was not an active war. Really, it was not. No, that was right out. I deny that completely. And anyone who had lost ships in Philip's seizure gained the right to wage private war against Spain, which was basically every merchant company. The result was that a couple hundred ships a year sailing out to be pirates. An expedition was sent to take Iberian fishing fleets in the Outer Banks, and a large expedition under Drake fitted out. He had some 22 ships, 2 of which were Queen ships, and over 2,000 soldiers. They got underway as quickly as they could, very poorly prepared for a long ocean voyage, without properly distributing food and water for the long voyage, because they were afraid the Queen would countermand the order to sail, a real fear. You can just imagine how delicate this all is. You don't want war. You think you simply cannot afford it. Your government is so short of money. But all this short of war stuff you're doing, supporting the Portuguese opposition to Spanish rule, seizing money, meanwhile Philip is seizing ships that were legally trading and openly preparing invasion. So this is dangerous, oh so dangerous, and you send out your best man and hope he can accomplish something while keeping enough force at home to protect from the sudden onset of war. But will sending out Drake cross that line? Imagine having to make that decision. On the one hand, it could do us a lot of good. And on the other hand, it could just plunge us into a war we don't want. And on the gripping hand, the war might be unavoidable anyway. Drake wants to go, so he goes, even though not fully prepared. By the way, almost all these significant pirate adventures are funded by joint stock companies, special purpose vehicles for a single pirate sailing. The Queen is credited with putting £20,000 into the total capital of £60,000 that finances this huge, for England, force. So Drake sails to the Spanish port of Vigo on the Atlantic coast, north of Portugal, where he takes some time to get some supplies and rearrange things. Meanwhile, he is fulfilling the official version of his mission, which is to demand the return of the English merchant ships. The Spanish say, "Oh, haven't you heard? We already released them." Without proof, of course. Well, Drake is having none of it, so he seizes ships and sends troops ashore to plunder. I mean, this is all happening in Spain. You would think Philip and the Spanish court would be spitting fire over this. But this is where the challenge of the 16th century context comes in. Tough to remember.
You mean that with just 2,000 soldiers, they take a major port city in Iberia proper, without there even being a war?
L'audace, toujours l'audace. Spain was regularly plagued with slave raiders from North Africa. In fact, large coastal areas of the Mediterranean were basically depopulated. In Italy and Sicily, too. because the slavers were taking so many people into North African slavery. Estimates are 1 to 1.25 million people were taken as slaves by North Africans, mainly Spanish and Italian people. And when you consider that the entire population of England was 2.5 million in 1500, it helps you get an idea of the scale of this monstrosity. In previous episodes, when I mentioned slavery was warping Spanish society and politics, this is that again. While the Spanish were off enslaving people in the Americas, and also starting with West Africans too, they were being enslaved at home also. So suffering a coastal raid with a thin veneer of a good reason wasn't such a big deal. Anyway, they cut a deal where Drake could load up on food and water if he returned all the stuff he stole.
It's such a different way to approach the world. It's mind-blowing.
Very hard to keep that context in mind. Anyway, the 2 big treasure fleets for the year arrived safely in Lisbon and Cadiz, while Drake was busy up in Vigo, so that opportunity was missed. So Drake headed for Madeira, but finding that too well defended, he landed at Santiago in the Cape Verde Islands. There they finally got enough food for the voyage, but found no treasure, so they burned the town to the ground and sailed on to the Caribbean. And there they attacked the local capital of Santo Domingo on Hispaniola. Despite having a fort, garrison, and local militia, they just weren't up to fighting the English. Viking parallels again. They got about 25,000 ducats, plus everything valuable that they could carry, and freed about 80 slaves and brought them along. These now ex-slaves were African, Turkish, and French. And by this time, a plague. A fever had killed about 300 people in the fleet, so a little extra manpower was handy. This fever didn't let up for the voyage, so the expedition was getting weaker and weaker as we go. This fever had a decisive impact on the voyage. Then they headed straight for Cartagena in modern Colombia, and this was probably the biggest and richest place in the Caribbean at the time, and on the Spanish Main. And this was no surprise attack. Word got out from Santo Domingo that they were next. They had about 1,000 soldiers, and they got busy building fortifications. Well, the pirates, just went straight into the attack. There was one brief pike battle, soon over. The Spanish ran. One fort held out one night. Maybe 40 people died on both sides, and the Spanish surrendered. So the pirates got over 100,000 in cash, but were pretty disappointed by the plunder since the Spanish had warning. They were able to get a lot of their movable valuables into the countryside. In propaganda terms, the English had their great victory, but word had come of a large Spanish fleet coming for Drake from Spain, and the fever had reduced their soldiers to less than 1,000 fit men. The Spanish accounts all say that Drake was planning to go to Panama again, but that may have been misdirection, or maybe the Vikings felt they weren't up to fighting a great fleet battle with the fever raging, men weak and dropping like flies. Also, there is the question of Drake's secret instructions. Everyone thinks he had some, since this was common practice, but they have remained secret to us. It could be that he was instructed to avoid anything that could look like a great victory for the Spanish. Tough to say. Anyway, he freed slaves again, a couple hundred, and also 300 local Indian women. In the event, he headed for Havana, hung out for a while without landing, and headed for Florida. St. Augustine in Florida was the main danger to the hopes of English colonization, even more than the mosquito and the locals. French Huguenots had recently set up a colony in Florida, several hundred strong, and the Spanish, well, they attacked it. And fair enough, they had claimed Florida, but when the French surrendered, the Spanish massacred them all, man, woman, and child. Drake's friend Raleigh was still trying to colonize Roanoke at this time, so attacking Spanish Florida seemed like a really good idea. They burned St. Augustine to the ground, the town, the fort, and they razed all the outlying farms. And this may have been the greatest service Drake made to the future, though none would have known it at the time. Now the voyagers return with about 45,000 pounds in cash and about 240 captured cannon. For the joint stock company, there is a slight loss, but the success of the voyage is all about its impact in Europe, England, and Spain. The English did damage far out of proportion to the treasure that they took home. all over the Spanish Empire, fortification and building started getting serious. Troops and ships were sent everywhere. The Spanish started a whole new method of sending treasure fleets, which was successful. The 1590s were a great decade for Spanish treasure. But this caused Spanish resources to be widely dispersed when they needed to be concentrated. The morale of everyone fighting the Spanish went up at the thought of Spanish defeats in Vigo, Santiago, Santo Domingo, and Cartagena, and St. Augustine, and the vision of Spain blundering about while a nimble English fleet does whatever it wants. How come the Spanish can never catch the English? Must be God's will. I don't know. Also, this Spanish preparation to defend the Americas was happening against the backdrop of and positively hindering the preparations for the Spanish Armada. The Iberian merchants upon whom the crown depended for credit were all convinced, if their surviving letters are evidence, on the need to invade and subdue England. And once Elizabeth intervened by land in the United Provinces in 1585 and cut off the sea route from Iberia to the Low Countries, it became a clamor. For them, Flanders was as important as the American colonies. We think Philip could ignore his merchants to a great extent, but he was committed to the Netherlands, United Provinces, as the key to Northern Europe, and now England was the key to the United Provinces. So what happened? Episode 15 covers the Armada, but the year before, Drake scored another great victory, which reads a lot like Aragorn's attack on Umbar in the years before the action in The Lord of the Rings, covered in Appendix A. The Spanish were gathering forces for a couple of years, trying to keep as much as possible in Iberia for the attack, despite all the other demands on their forces. The plan was to attack with 550 ships, led by 25 huge galleons. But as episode 15 showed, only 130 to 140 armed ships were actually available for the crucial attack.
Also, large forces gathered together for 2 years would practically guarantee disease outbreaks with the state of public health in the 1580s.
Yep. And when the Armada sailed, they were short many skilled positions, even though they had a significant advantage in cannon. And during episode 15, I mentioned the Spanish tried boarding tactics that the English avoided. One reason was that many English armed merchantmen had been built for the Mediterranean trade, especially the Levant trade. They were totally expert at avoiding the pirate galleys that were seemingly everywhere. And I'll mention it here that French merchants would outcompete the English merchants in the Levant trade. It's good to remember when we get to the Anglo-French rivalry that the English did not always have it their own way, though it seems like it sometimes. Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed in 1587 after the breaking of the Babington Plot, and by the logic of monarchical power, things changed drastically. One reason Philip was unsure of attacking England was that Mary, Queen of Scots, might be the ultimate winner, and as a Guise, it might result in French power ascending in England, as Spanish power seemed to do when he was King of England. Well, with this Mary dead, and the Spanish nobility were outraged over her killing, he could more safely put a Catholic monarch of his choice on the English throne if victorious. So with the attack on England virtually assured now, Drake led an expedition, Aragorn's expedition, against Cadiz in 1587. Well, got together 16 ships, including 4 of the Queen's ships, and sailed off. This time, just 1 day ahead of instructions from the Royal Council canceling the voyage. Amazing. But how seriously do we consider this royal change of heart? I mean, they waited 9 days, very significant in Norse mythology, to send out a fast pinnace to catch up with Drake with new orders. Then the pinnace captain took a Spanish prize and came home with it, rather than sailing after Drake. And the captain swore the weather was against him. I mean, triple skullduggery is possible. The pinnace captain was a Hawkins man who would have been thick with Drake, but a simple double skullduggery is more likely. This is one of those times when we can't always believe the received history. Elizabeth changed her mind? Really? The Queen wanted to cover her ass with a plausible claim that Drake was not acting under valid orders if anything went wrong. And since that was her regular MO, it seems most likely. Hell, she even told Philip she didn't mean to have Mary, Queen of Scots, executed. Yes, I did sign her death warrant. Of course I signed it, but I never said they should carry it out.
But that sounds like how politicians work today.
Yeah, huh? La plus ça change. So Drake gets to Cadiz, but his little fleet is scattered by storm. Still, he goes right into the outer harbor at dawn without slowing down to reconnoiter. And a battle ensues with 6 Spanish galleys, 2 forts, and some armed merchantmen resist as well. I mean, conditions are ideal for the galleys, but they're still crushed by the English warships. They sink and capture some 30 or so of the 60 ships in the outer harbor, and go on to assemble a force of small pinnaces and attack the inner harbor and take the big Spanish warship there. It should have been able to sink half the English instead of being captured. How they did this, I have never learned. It seems amazing, impossible. Well, they have their prizes and crews scattered among all these prizes, and they're ready to go. Get out of Dodge while the getting is good. But the wind dies, and they're stuck in the harbor until midnight with Spanish shore guns firing at them the whole time, though ineffectively it seems. Then they park themselves off Cape St. Vincent, which is that jut of land in southern Portugal near Lagos. And here, all the normal coast traffic had to pass by with no good way around. And they'd already taken many tons of Armada supplies. Wine, cordage, ship's biscuit, and now they were picking off fishing boats and cargo hulks. 60 hulks in total, if I recall, carrying timber and other naval supplies. If they could stay there, the Armada would have to come out and fight, because otherwise it could never gather supplies. Drake even realized this. His letters home are full of this idea. A modern naval strategy seems about to be born. But Drake was financed by a joint stock company rather than an official government operation, so after a couple weeks, he haired off after a rich prize, an East Indiaman full of spices worth 115,000 pounds, which he took, and so he headed home, after the rest had taken the occasion of being scattered by storm to return home. How dangerous was it to hang out off the coast of Spain? Too dangerous for me, answered most. Still, this put off the Armada for a year. The Spanish Admiral Santa Cruz sailed out trying to find Drake and protect a treasure fleet, and came back unready to invade England that year. And early the next year, Santa Cruz, an experienced, capable admiral, died. And Medina Sidonia was appointed in his stead, and we covered how that turned out. The English could not really beat the Spanish with the technology at hand if the Spanish were competent. But the Spanish were not. And so Philip's prestige suffered, and the Dutch War of Independence went on as we covered in episode 14. Though I think I would play up the contribution of English ground troops more than I did at the time. They were paid for by the Dutch, and with competent leadership, which they did get with Maurice of Nassau, they were effective and well-regarded troops. And more than that, at times, they were half of Maurice's troops. So I think it's fair to say that Elizabeth's land intervention was decisive to the result. Back at sea, the Armada did end any hopes of the Roanoke colony. Ship, stay home! And by my reading of events, it seems impossible for any English colonization effort to succeed until Ireland could be removed as a strategic threat. At some point, we'll need to talk about Elizabethan Ireland. I need to remind you of the other 2 armadas destroyed by God's finger before they could get so much as halfway to England. I say God's finger. At the time, they used the expression Jehovah's breath. But there were 2 other armadas. Yes, Spain has a lot of resources. Defeat follows defeat, and they're still trying the knockout blow. One in the 1590s that invaded Brittany, and another that landed in Ireland. Yes, a Spanish armada did land about 4,000 troops or so in Ireland in 1601. But it was God's intervention that was decisive, that it was so open and obvious and clear to all, probably had the greatest effect on Elizabeth's showdown with the Puritans in the 1590s. More on that in episode 34, but let me say with some glee, if you're going to get into religious disputes, having God in your camp is cool, it's useful, fantastic, nothing better. The pirates inflicted huge losses on the Spanish, with 300 ships taken in the first 3 years after the Armada, thousands by the end of the war in 1604. The declared value of prizes in England only averaged about £140,000 a year, but remember that the Crown government could function and prosecute a war on only £300,000 a year, and this was declared value only. These were pirates who were also sometimes privateers, or vice versa, and sold prizes everywhere, and carrying away movable valuables was natural, suspected by all, and expected by all, including the seamen. In all, the pirates probably added more to the economy than taxes drained it. People would say England was never so prosperous as when she was at war with Spain. Economic analysis suggests that the returns to trade were actually higher at the time, just less glamorous. In the same way, you could say that history podcasts are more valuable to the present than keeping up with the Kardashians. And then there was George Clifford's expedition to the Azores in 1589. 6 ships, and off the coast of Spain they quickly captured ships of the French Catholic League and Flemish merchants full of Newfoundland fish, worth £5,000. And these were Spanish allies, so fair game. Then they sailed into a port in the Azores, falsely flying a Spanish flag. Yep, pretending to be Spanish ships.
No way! That sounds like a movie. That worked in real life?
Yep, they captured 6 merchant ships laden with silks, other textiles, and wine again. Shortly after, they captured 7 more ships with cargoes of gold, silver, silks, ivory, and, amusingly, coconuts. Also, 1 cargo of goat skins, no idea what they made of that. And there was also a Spanish galleon, far superior in size to the English, that tried to escape, carrying 200,000 ducats of gold. The English couldn't really deal with a real warship so easily, but they did sink it after a long running battle. The next 2 islands they came to took different strategies in self-defense. At Graciosa, the English landed only to be greeted by the locals with truce flags, 60 tons of wine, and lots of fresh food. A long party ensued, and a Spanish treasure fleet that happened to be passing was completely missed by the drunken pirates, which by now included a ship of Raleigh's, which just happened to be passing by. But at Santa Maria, the locals resisted with guns and rocks and desperate fighting with their fingernails. The Portuguese fighters could be very tough. But, not discouraged, the Vikings picked up a couple more rich prizes a few days later. Sugar, Brazil wood, silver, porcelain, dyes, yet more hides, and this time a powerful Spanish warship too. Fortune smiles. Actually, many scores of the men died of dehydration and shipwreck on the way home, but the survivors all made fortunes. Next week, maybe just a couple more of these super voyages that were filling the English consciousness, and then wrap up the war with Spain before getting into some economic issues and Elizabeth's defeat of the Puritans.
Before we sign off, though, how serious were you really about those parallels you made between the English and the Vikings?
We know a lot less about the Vikings than we usually pretend, so the Viking concept can be pretty elastic. And when I read some of the history of Drake and the pirates, Andrews, Piceno, Mary Keeler, I can substitute Vikings in my mind, and it works perfectly well. It's fun and therefore a stimulus to thought. You heard how this parallel occurred to Cami in real time last week. It's also a reminder that I made unusual claims about Viking influence in Britain in earlier episodes, of a greater continuity than is really mainstream history. But I pointed out enough where I was playing God of the Gap stuff and making the meta point that historians do this all the time. There are fashions in history, unfortunately. And, because I think it's fun, you should consider the possibility that I made up all this as a rationalization to justify my sense of humor. See you next week, and thank you to Bygdøy. It was really great to have you on the program.
Okay, we'll figure it out.
We've just listened to episode 31 with Bygdøy, new guest on the program. She was really great.
I really enjoyed hearing from Bygdøy. It's great to hear her voice. I'm familiar with Sir Francis Drake, living in the Bay Area.
Sure.
But somehow I had a big hole in my knowledge of him regarding Florida.
Oh, yeah, that he really thoroughly devastated the Spanish in St. August, devastating as you could possibly be. Most of the Spanish hid out in the swamps and forests around it. It's amazing. And disease always had a huge impact, and especially, Europeans in the tropics before public health was really good, the death rates were enormous.
Right. As Bygdøy said, it sounds a lot like a Hollywood movie rather than a true life situation at the time.
I'm still stunned and amazed that there's never been a movie about Cranmer, and there's never been a movie about Drake's attack on Cadiz, or maybe there has been, I just don't know about it, but it seems like that would be tremendously great fodder for a blockbuster.
Well, hey, here's maybe opportunity to get involved with Hollywood.
Yeah, well, we'll see. With episode 32, I think we maybe have a filmmaker coming on.
Oh, very cool. And then the 1590s being the great decade for Spanish treasure.
They established a convoy system that was never defeated by the English. It would start to fail a few times in the 17th century. First the Dutch would take one, then the English would take one, and then the English would take another one.
But you're not talking, it didn't seem like exactly the treasure we picture from our Pirates of the Caribbean and Disney movies and stuff of popular culture. You talked about Brazil wood.
Oh,
and
well,
what was
so
it?
that would be like,
coconuts?
Coconuts. That would be regular stuff. But the treasure fleets were literally ships that were full of gold bars and silver bars and jewels from the mines in Mexico and Peru and Potosi.
So much like what we see on movies and treasure hunts and stories of pirates.
It's Kelly's Heroes, man. Kelly's Heroes, man.
Yeah, but when you said Brazil wood, that caught my ear.
Yeah, there's a lot more valuable stuff going back and forth than just gold and silver.
Right. The slavers taking people. I guess I never pictured the trade of Italian slaves so heavy.
Underappreciated. Italians and Spanish were the most heavily slaved by the North Africans. But there was also a time in the 17th century when they were taking people from Iceland and Ireland, southwest England.
It's a good reminder in these times.
Yeah, in the ancient world, everybody was a slave all the time, everywhere, and it sort of gradually diminished, but it's a long uphill battle.
Oh, your story about how they pretended to be Spanish.
Oh, I know. Isn't that cool? They just put on a bunch of Spanish flags and sailed on into the harbor.
Grab some flags from a ship you've probably taken somewhere, or who knows where you got them. The local market, or make them up, or whatever. Fly the flag, pretend you're Spanish. It's a bit like Halloween.
Oh, yeah.
Dress up to be someone you're not.
Yeah, and imagine encounters between individual ships when you're, very far away from home and there's no witnesses whatsoever. Anything can happen. And how many flags do you have in reserve for situations like that? You should pick one flag to fly. They pick some flag to fly. Doesn't tell you much of anything until you're maybe within shouting distance. And being within shouting distance or ship's boat distance is also within cannon distance. So the whole thing was just extraordinarily dangerous. And if you were ruthless, an English pirate could take an English ship. Just make sure you kill everybody so there's no witnesses. Hey, I haven't introduced Cammie on the program in a long time. Cammie's my wife, and this is the unscripted portion of the program. And the unscripted portion is here because, hey, life is unscripted.
Yeah,
This is a lesson for you.
He just has me listen to an episode, and I wing it.
And you do great. I love you. Big thanks to Bygdøy. It's really awesome that we could hear your voice on the program. And everyone, please leave a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. Thank you for listening.